Hi, I'm Tony Northup, and welcome to my free 1-hour hands-on overview of how to use the new Olympus OMD E-M10. My favorite little camera for travel and casual photography. Is just a great camera to use. If you want to see tutorials for other cameras, maybe you have a friend who has a different type of camera, visit sdp.io/tutorials. We have more than a dozen different cameras covered, all for free. I am not going to cover every single feature and function of this camera. That would take hours and it would actually be wasting your time. I am going to show you all the features that you actually need, especially as you're working through my book, Stunning Digital Photography. If you don't have the book, that's fine. But I won't be covering a lot of features that I think aren't key and core to photography. A lot of it is just distractions. First, let's go over the physical controls on the camera. You might already know how to put the lens on and off. Don't worry, you don't have to sit through me going over basic stuff. Look in the description of this video for a full table of contents that will let you jump to any part of this video. I even have lens and tripod recommendations at the end of the video. If you already know how to use every part of it, but you just want to find out some good gear to get, you can jump right to that. Start out by showing you how to put the lens on and take it off. There's a button on the left side of the camera here. Push that in and then twist the lens counterclockwise to take it off. This exposes the sensor. To attach it, look for the red dot on the lens and line it up with the red dot on the body here. Match those up, twist it clockwise until you hear it click, then just wiggle it back and forth and make sure it's locked on there really good. The battery and memory card are hidden in a compartment on the bottom. I love that they put the memory card in the same compartment as the battery. Pull that switch back and flip it open and it reveals them both. Of course, you have to get your battery charged up. No USB charging on this camera, so you got to carry that charger with you when you travel. The memory card slides in with the front of the memory card facing the lens. Just push it in until it locks right in there. You can take this memory card out and put it into a memory card reader. That's the way I recommend most people load their pictures onto their computer. Get a USB 3 memory card reader. They're faster and generally not that expensive. On the right side of the camera here, we see a port that reveals the USB and HDMI ports. The USB port here on the top also allows you to unload pictures from the camera. If you don't happen to have a memory card reader, you can use a USB cable and treat it like a USB drive. The HDMI out port could theoretically be used for recording video, but most likely you would use that if you were on vacation and you wanted to show pictures you had taken on maybe the TV in your hotel room. If you were to get a micro HDMI to HDMI, standard HDMI cable, you'd be able to hook it up to the TV and play back your pictures on the big screen. Now let's get to the fun stuff, actually taking a picture. There's an on-off switch on the back of the camera here. Flip that up to on, and you're pretty much ready to go. You can use the display on the back just like your phone. Just point it at something and push the screen. It will take a picture. You can also put your eye right to this viewfinder. And then you can look around. I'll get a picture of my cameraman, Justin. And that's really all there is to taking a picture. As you're looking through the viewfinder, if things start to look blurry, that's a problem with the diopter. The diopter allows you to adjust the viewfinder to match your glasses prescription. If you're a glasses wearer, take your glasses off and you'll be able to look through the viewfinder and have everything sharp if the diopter is adjusted correctly. Whether or not you're wearing glasses, the diopter being misadjusted can cause everything to be blurry and make you think your camera's not focusing when it actually is. The diopter is located right over here, and you can see it just twists up and down. What you want to do, which everybody should do, is just hold the camera up to your eye and look at the numbers on the viewfinder display and just twist that diopter until everything looks as sharp as can be. If you switch it between two different people in the family, you're going to have to agree on where that diopter wants to be, or you'll just have to change it every single time you just each pick up the camera. Now let's talk about some of the view options. Whether you're looking through the viewfinder or the back of the display here, you can allow it to show you different types of data. So right now you can see that it's showing me the shutter speed, the aperture, the exposure compensation, and a histogram. That's all stuff that'll make more sense as you start to work through my book, Stunning Digital Photography. If you want to see different information or hide it all away, just hit the info button here. You can see as I iterate through these options, one option hides all the data and just allows you to focus on the composition. This option shows you a virtual horizon. So I can see that my camera now is level when it appears green there. The level also works for vertical tilt. That's especially useful for landscape photos where you want everything to be aligned perfectly, because otherwise you'll have to straighten it in post, which means cropping and rotating it a little bit. Hit info again, and we see just some critical data, the shutter speed, the aperture, the exposure compensation, without that histogram in there. So just kind of switch through that until you find the data that you like. For me, my favorite setting is this with histogram. You do have some options for what you see in the viewfinder. You can edit these by opening up the menu system. So I'm going to push this menu button here, and then go down to these the little gears here. And I can scroll to the right and go down to J. That's where my view options are. You can see it's labeled built-in EVF. EVF is electronic viewfinder. I'll scroll to the right here and allow me to see some more options. And you can see if I select that first option, built-in EVF style, I can iterate through several different options here. I like style 3, which is the default. It fills the viewfinder with the scene and overlays some data, but if you don't like any of the scene being covered by the text, you can change that by using one of the other styles. I'll go back here. You can go into the info settings and see the different types of information that it's going to show. The highlights and shadow will highlight different parts of the picture that are over or underexposed. That can be useful. Generally, I just prefer to use the histogram and the level gauge and the basic information. So for me, the default settings are good, but once you get into it and you start thinking about your exposure, you might find yourself going in and turning on the highlights and the shadows. You can display a grid, which I like to do. This is especially good if you're working through chapter 2 of Stunning Digital Photography and you want to make a point to use the rule of thirds, for example, more often. The grid I just selected here will overlay a rule of thirds grid on the live view, and just to help you line things up just perfectly. The EVF auto switch is on by default. That means the auto switch automatically turns on the electronic viewfinder when you hold it up to your eye, rather than requiring you to manually push this switch on the side here. You can't always manually push that to switch between the live view on the back and the electronic viewfinder. I'll hit the menu button again and go back down to J here. You can use the EVF adjust menu here to adjust the brightness of the screen. One nice feature about this camera is the touchscreen shooting, which I briefly mentioned earlier. While you're looking through the touchscreen, you can just tap the screen to take a picture. You can change it by just tapping this icon over here on the left side of the screen. So right now, it shows a little finger with a shutter button. That means tap to shoot. If I hold it, it'll focus first. You can change that just by tapping it. Now it shows a finger with a line through it. That means that it will just ignore the touchscreen. If for some reason, some people don't like touchscreens, they feel like they're setting it off automatically. So that's easy enough to turn off. If you choose this option, it's touch to focus, and it will refocus as you touch different parts of the screen. But to take a picture, you'll actually have to reach up and push the shutter button. Let's talk about how to review a picture once you've taken it. It's really easy and pretty obvious. There's a play button here in the upper right corner. So you push play, and now you can flip through the different pictures by using the directional pad here. I don't think anybody will have a hard time with that. That's my cameraman, Justin. You can zoom in by tapping the screen and then hitting the magnify button here, and then you can zoom right in. Oh, looks like I actually got a little bit blurry. That's why it's a good thing to go back and check the pictures really carefully. You'll notice that once I've tapped the screen, it gives me a couple of options. For example, I can click that to actually share the picture across Wi-Fi to the mobile phone app, and I won't go into detail about that because it's different for different platforms like Android and iPhone, and they tend to update it really regularly. But I actually find the Olympus Wi-Fi system to be among the most useful. While you're reviewing a picture, you can show different information by hitting the info button. So right now, I'm just seeing the picture. If I hit the info button, I can display a little bit of data about the picture, like how it was recorded. Hit it again, and now I can see the red, blue, and green, and just brightness histograms there. That'll all start to make sense in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography, as well as the shutter speed, camera settings, and other information. Just hit it again to go back to the full picture. Now, I do want to point out, you can review pictures using the electronic viewfinder, and it's actually terribly useful. It feels weird to review a picture like this at first, but when you're out on a really sunny day, it can be impossible to see this nice articulating touchscreen. It'll just be completely washed out. Put your eye up to here and you can review the pictures. It's also really nice if you're in a place where the bright light would disturb somebody. If you're taking a picture in a concert and everything is dimly lit, you don't want to sit there and just be reviewing your pictures when you're lighting up the entire auditorium. Hold the camera up to your eye, you'll have a bit of privacy as you're looking through your pictures. Now let's talk about how to use the different camera modes. We're going to start to actually control the camera. Up until now, you've probably been in automatic mode, which is okay. The I auto setting there, or the P setting, which is a little bit less automated, allow the camera to make all the important decisions about your photography, and it will usually stop you from screwing things up too bad. And if you hand your camera to somebody else to take a picture, those are still the modes you want to use. But once you start to learn to control your camera, you're going to want to keep it in either aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual mode. We'll discuss each of those, but first, aperture priority allows you to control the aperture with the camera's main dial. The aperture is the opening inside the lens itself. When the opening is small like this, it's letting in very little light, which means that you'll have to use a longer shutter speed. But that little bitty opening works like a pinhole camera and makes your background and your foreground appear sharp and in focus. When you open up the aperture, the iris, to be really big, it lets in a lot more light, and that background gets thrown out of focus, allowing you to create beautiful portraits with nicely blurred backgrounds, and allowing you to use a faster shutter speed and a lower ISO. Now, I threw out a lot of technical terms there, and again, we cover all that in Stunning Digital Photography. I can't go into all of that here, but I will show you how to use and control this particular camera. In aperture priority mode, you can use the main dial here, which is the back dial. It's right accessible on the thumb, and I find it the easiest one to access. Scroll it to the left to use a lower f-stop number. Remember, low f-stop numbers mean low background sharpness. Showing it down here is f2.8. Scroll it to the right to use a high f-stop number. High f-stop numbers, high background sharpness. Generally, you want to use the lowest f-stop number you can while still getting enough of your subject in focus, because wide open at f2.8, you might find there's actually too much background blur for a lot of pictures. Low f-stop numbers just mean the overall picture will be cleaner, and that's really important on these little cameras. Let's move on and talk about shutter priority. I use aperture priority for day-to-day photo taking. It's almost always the mode I have selected. If I'm taking pictures of action, I'll switch it to shutter priority, which is indicated with an S on the dial here. Now, as you switch to shutter priority, the main dial in the back here changes personality. Instead of controlling the aperture, it's now controlling the shutter speed. So you can see when it says 160, it's talking about 1/60th of a second, a fraction of a second. So very fast shutter speed. As I scroll it to the left, the shutter speed gets longer and longer. And eventually it'll show 2. And that means 1/2, 1/2 of a second. So as I take the picture, you'll hear the shutter go. See, it stayed open for a little while there. So scrolling left gives you slower shutter speeds, and slower shutter speeds let in more light, but they also show more movement. If you took a picture at half a second of somebody walking, it would be ghostly and blurred. If you're shooting sports, you want to make sure to use a high shutter speed. For kid sports, I'll usually shoot at 1/250th of a second. For high school, college sports, I might be at 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second. Once you get into flying birds, wildlife photography, that's usually shot at 1/2000th of a second. Things like hummingbirds might actually be at 1/4000th of a second, or just as fast as you can possibly get, because those wings are really fast. Generally, with the aperture, use the lowest f-stop number you can. With the shutter, use the slowest shutter you can, while freezing the motion of your handshake and freezing the subject's motion. So if your pictures end up with motion blur, you can actually see the subject moving in the picture. Use a faster shutter speed, and it should rectify the problem. But we discuss in detail how to solve blurry pictures in Chapter 5 of Stunning Digital Photography. Now let's talk about manual mode, which gives you control of both the shutter speed and the aperture at the same time. Manual mode is indicated by an M on the main dial here, so I'll just flip that over. And now the 2 dials on the top of the camera here are going to control the shutter speed and aperture separately. So as I move this left dial, the back dial, you can see it's still adjusting the shutter speed. And as I go to the left, you see that the display on the back gets brighter and brighter. As I go to the right, it's getting darker and darker because faster shutter speeds let in less light. Same with the aperture. This front dial here now controls the f-stop. So as I scroll it to the right, it's using a higher and higher f-stop number, a smaller and smaller opening that's making the display much darker. As I scroll to the left, the opening is getting bigger and bigger, letting in more and more light. Even though you are controlling both the f-stop and the aperture, the camera can still make automatic decisions about the exposure if you want it to, because there is a third factor that the camera controls in the exposure, and that's ISO. We'll discuss ISO in just a little bit, as well as how to configure it for automatic or manual mode. While I generally use aperture or shutter priority, manual mode is useful for times when I want to make sure that I'm using a specific shutter speed and a specific aperture. Anytime I'm in the studio and using studio lights, I have to be using manual mode. You can't use auto exposure with that. It's also really useful for night photography where all cameras tend to screw up the exposure. There are lots of scenarios where manual mode is useful, but I want to make it clear that it's not the mode that professionals use in day-to-day scenarios outside of the studio. People think manual mode and manual focus is the way professionals go, but most professionals rely on auto exposure too, because when you're working, you don't want to be thinking about the little mechanics of things. You want to be thinking about storytelling and mood and lighting and everything but the mechanics of it. So it's actually good to let your camera make some intelligent decisions. One more mode I want to talk about is bulb mode. Some cameras have a separate mode for bulb mode, and for that reason you'll see me in SDP refer to bulb mode sometimes. This camera has bulb mode built into manual mode. So to select bulb mode, select manual mode first. Then adjust your shutter slower and slower and slower. You can go all the way down to 1/60th or 60 full seconds a minute, and then scroll left one more time and it switches to bulb mode. The screen there got dark because it's now in bulb mode. And in bulb mode, the shutter stays open as long as I hold this shutter button down. So if I want to make a 2-second exposure, I hold the shutter down for 2 seconds. And you can see it's processing the picture now. Bulb mode is useful for times when you need to take a picture of more than 60 seconds. That's the only time you would ever need to do it. For example, maybe you want to make a 10-minute exposure at night out in the darkness. It's very possible that that's what you would need to properly expose a really, truly dark scene. Now, I held my finger down on the shutter here for 2 seconds. If you're making a 10-minute exposure, you probably wouldn't want to stand there with your finger on it. If nothing else, well, you get bored, but you'd probably also shake the camera while you're holding your finger there, and that would ruin your picture. So what you would do instead is get a remote shutter release for this little Olympus, and you would use that remote shutter trigger to lock the shutter open. I like that they have a 60-second exposure because I don't often take exposures of more than 60 seconds, so bulb mode isn't as necessary on this camera. There are a couple of options related to bulb mode that I want to show you. I'll hit the menu button and go down again to the gears and then go down to E, exposure and ISO. On the second page here, the second and third options are bulb/timer and bulb/time monitor. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how to make your screen not get dark when you're in bulb mode. By default, it's set to -7, and that makes the screen really dark and hard to see. It's actually pretty smart. It seems weird when you're testing it in a well-lit environment like this, but if you have bulb mode on, it's almost always for night photography in really dark environments. So the default setting for the screen would be extremely bright, and it would be blinding you, and then your eyes wouldn't be able to see the environment because your pupils would constrict. So that is actually a smart setting to have it get darker. But if you want to make it brighter, you can bring it up to 0. The timer here sets the maximum time that the shutter will stay open in bulb mode. So I don't know why it's set to 8 minutes. Maybe it's because they think you're going to lock the shutter open and then walk away from the camera. If that's the case, you could use this to set the shutter speed, but you would still need a remote trigger for the camera because you can't just hold your finger on there. But if you're using it for night photography and you're using a timer, which I would recommend, then I would go ahead and set the timer setting here to the maximum of 30 minutes. I'm going to take a quick minute to plug my books, Stunning Digital Photography, my Lightroom books, and my photography buying guide. Stunning Digital Photography on the left there, it's a video book, which is not a book like you've seen before, but it includes over 12 hours of video training as well as a full book. These are all available in ebook and paperback formats. The ebooks start at $9.99. That includes all that video, access to a social group on Facebook where you can get your questions answered and people will help you out. It's a really great group. The Lightroom book, if you're into post-processing, will teach you how to use software to organize your pictures, to edit them, to make them better. And the photography buying guide will help you understand all the mumbo jumbo of lenses and bodies and tripods and flashes and studio lighting, help you get the most bang for your buck. I'll show you how to save some money by buying used gear and selling your used gear. This can save you thousands of dollars. I want you to remember that photography is not about learning the buttons and dials on your camera. It's not about mastering camera settings. That's such a small part of it. Photography is more art than science. These books, in particular Stunning Digital Photography on the left, teach you to master the artistic side of photography as well as the mechanical and technical side of it. So you'll learn things like lighting and posing and expression and mood, storytelling. These are the components of a fantastic and stunning picture, and I'll teach you all of those and dig deep into specific subjects like portraits, landscapes, wildlife, and even underwater photography, macro photography. If you're dissatisfied with anything, you can just send me an email and I'll give you your money back. Those are also available on Amazon. Good place to see reviews for them. Just search for Tony Northrup, my name. Now let's talk about the different shutter modes. By default, when you take a picture, the camera will just take a single picture and then stop. Well, I still have it in bulb mode, so the shutter stayed open, but I'll switch this back to Aperture Priority. It just takes one picture, and that's okay. But I almost always rattle off a couple of frames. If nothing else, if you're taking a picture of a person, they might have a little dirt face, they might be blinking. If you just rattle off 2 or 3 frames out of habit, you can go back and pick the best one. We're not shooting film here where every picture costs you something. Take 2 or 3 pictures, pick the best, and throw the rest away. To change your shutter mode to, say, continuous, hit the OK button here, and this brings up a menu system that makes it really easy to find the settings that you want. So scroll down to this box here, and that allows you to change the shutter mode. Now you can scroll to the right or left to select the different options, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. My favorite mode is sequential H. That means high-speed continuous shutter. So I'll select that, and as I take pictures, there you go, 8 frames a second, just rattling it off like that pretty fast. You can also select the sequential L, which is a slower shutter. I'll show you in just a sec how to customize those speeds. You also have a couple of options for the delay of the camera. There's a 12-second delay, which when you push it, you can see the red light comes on. This is for those times when you put the camera on a tripod and you want to take a picture of your family, and you push the shutter button, and then you like run around the tripod and put your arm around your kids. It starts to blink when it's about to take a picture. There you go. That's what the self-timer is for. There's also a 2-second timer, and I'm not fast enough to run around a tripod in 2 seconds. But a 2-second timer is useful for eliminating camera shake when you have the camera on a tripod and you want to make a really, really sharp picture. So when you put a camera on a tripod and you push the shutter button, that shakes the camera just a little bit. 2 seconds is enough for the camera shake to pretty much stop. So anytime I have the camera on a tripod and I'm taking pictures of still life, I'll turn on that 2-second delay just to make my pictures a little sharper. There's one last option here, which is the custom self-timer. You can configure it by pushing the info button here. It will take multiple frames for you, which is terribly useful, especially when you're taking pictures of your kids, right? Because if you take 10 frames at, say, a half-second interval each, then when little Bobby puts rabbit ears up behind his sister, you'll be able to make him stop that, make him get a decent expression, and maybe by the time that 10th frame snaps, everybody will be okay. It's also a good thing for self-portrait just because people will blink. Even if everybody's trying really hard, somebody will blink, somebody will look away. One of those 10 frames is probably going to be good. So when I am taking those self-portraits, that's actually the mode I'll use, this custom mode. Just select it and then push the info button to change the settings. The timer tells you how long the camera will wait. This frame option tells you how many pictures it will take. And then the interval time is the time between the frames. So it will take 10 pictures after waiting 10 seconds, and each picture will wait half a second, 0.5 seconds, before taking the next picture. So it'll take pictures over a 5-second interval. I want to show you how to change the speed of continuous high and continuous low shooting. Hit the menu button here, go down to the gears, and then under the C option, release, you see 2 options, related options, L FPS and H FPS. This is the slower continuous shooting frames per second. I can scroll to the right, and by default it's 3.5 frames a second. If you want it to be slower, 2 frames a second, you can set that. Scroll to the right here for high frames per second, and you can select anything from 4 to 8 frames a second. Sometimes 8 frames a second can be a little fast, and you mean just to snap 1 or 2 pictures and you end up getting like 5 pictures, so you might slow it down if your fingers are a little sticky that way. Now let's talk about the different focusing modes. The focusing modes control how the camera focuses on a subject, whether it finds focus and locks it there, or whether it continues trying to track a moving subject. Basically, you'll choose different focusing modes for focusing on a still subject or focusing on a moving subject. By default, it's set up to focus on still subjects, and that is actually what you'll leave it on most of the time. If you need to focus on a moving subject, click OK there, and then we're going to scroll down until we find the autofocus options here. And now we can scroll to the right to select different options. You'll almost always want to use single AF with this camera. Again, for moving subjects, you can try using continuous autofocus. This camera's autofocus system for moving subjects is not the strongest, and it can be a little bit frustrating. But you can select CAF and it will try to keep the subject in focus. If you are going to use continuous autofocus, I suggest you use a higher f-stop number, like maybe f8 or f11. What that will do is give you more margin for error. Higher f-stop numbers, if you remember, give you more depth of field. They get more in focus. They make the background sharper. That way, if the camera misses focus by a little bit, you might not notice because your subject could still be fairly sharp, because everything will be fairly sharp. There are other focusing modes here. If you do set it to continuous focus, when you're done, be sure to set it back to single AF so that you're not frustrated the next time you use it. If you want to manually focus, that's an option. Just select MF there. And now you can focus by turning the focusing ring on the lens itself. And you can see as I'm turning the ring, the focusing is changing. There we go. Now I can see that this screen here is in focus. And it's not going to listen to me now when I try to autofocus it. It just isn't going to do it until I go back and turn autofocus back on. There's also an option for allowing autofocus and manual focus simultaneously, the SAF plus MF. And with this, I can autofocus, and then I can also just fine-tune it with the manual focus ring on the lens. I'm actually not a huge fan of that mode with this camera. I find that I accidentally turn the focusing ring too often. So generally I just use it on single autofocus mode, or I'll switch to manual focus mode. But the option is there for you to experiment with. There's one other option here, which is AF tracking. This is just a slightly modified version of the continuous AF that's supposed to be a little bit more intelligent. And in practice, I haven't noticed a significant difference in the usability between CAF and CAF tracking. But I suppose if you're tracking a moving subject, you might as well switch to that. I'll switch it back to single AF for now. And let's go on and talk about the autofocus points. Now, by default, this camera is going to look at the entire scene and try to figure out what you want to focus on. It does a pretty good job. In fact, it will even detect faces and focus on a face for you, so it's pretty accurate in that way. Sometimes, though, it won't be perfect, and it might focus on the wrong thing. You can select a specific focusing point in a couple of ways. And on this camera, I think by far the easiest way is just to touch the screen. I find that far easier than trying to move an autofocus point around. But you can also just grab the directional pad there and pan it around like that to pick your specific focusing point. The face priority feature can be configured. Click the OK button here. Scroll down a little face. And now as you scroll left and right, you can turn face priority off if you find it annoying. Face priority on. Face and eye priority on is the default, and it's really smart. It will try to find the nearest eye and focus on that, because in portrait photography, you always focus on the nearest eye. If you're taking a group photo, it might focus on the wrong face. In those situations, in group photo situations, you want to make sure you have a high enough f-stop to get everybody's face in focus. I cover portraits and group photos specifically in chapter 6 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography, so do check that out. The other options here allow you to have it automatically focus on the left or right eye. I like the eye and autofocus feature, but I wouldn't try to rely on it too much. It can be a little unpredictable, especially if you get into some of the shallow depth of field lenses that we'll talk about later, like this big ol' Olympus here. You'll find that it's not quite as accurate as you always want. Now let's talk about metering modes. Metering modes are how the camera determines how bright or dark your picture should be. When it automatically picks your shutter speed or aperture, this is the information it's using to make the right choice. I don't ever recommend changing the metering mode on this or any camera really. Instead, what I recommend doing is using the electronic viewfinder and looking at the histogram and then adjusting the exposure compensation up or down. I find that to be the most reliable and fastest way to control the exposure. If you're an old school film photographer and you know how to use center weighted metering and spot metering, I'll show you how to change it. But for most of us, you can save these brain cells and not learn how to change the metering mode. Hit the OK button here and scroll down to this thing that looks like a bit of armor, like 5 little pieces together there. ESP, which I think means you're psychic, means that it uses psychic powers, I guess, to determine the proper exposure. It's the default setting and it's the right setting. It intelligently looks at the entire scene. It can detect backlit scenes and adjust the exposure automatically for you. The other options here are center weighted, which looks at just a small part of the scene and gauges the entire exposure around that spot in the middle there. Spot metering just uses an even smaller spot. I'll just demonstrate spot metering. You can see the screen is really bright where it's white. And with spot metering on, the whole scene right now looks quite dark. I'll turn the histogram on so you can see it. Look how everything in the histogram is in the left half now. If I change that spot meter so it's on the black part of the screen, the camera tries to make that black spot gray. So it tries to make the white gray and it tries to make the black gray. And that's what spot metering does. It samples a very small part of the picture. And that's why spot metering isn't very easy to use. Because imagine you're taking a picture, you're a wedding photographer and you're taking a picture of a guy in a tux. If that spot happens to fall on his black jacket, then the whole picture is going to be very, very bright like this. If it falls on his white shirt, then the whole picture is going to be very dark like this. If you were to switch to the ESP metering, I'll select that, and then you can see as I pan around, the exposure changes. It changes a little bit, but not nearly as much. It's actually far more intelligent. There are a couple other metering modes just worth mentioning. The spot highlight allows you to put the spot on what you think should be the brightest part of the picture, and the spot shadow allows you to put the spot on what you think should be the darkest part of the picture. Again, this would make a lot of sense in the film days when every frame would cost you money, but nowadays, just look through the viewfinder, adjust the exposure compensation by using the dial on the back, or rather using the forward dial, and you'll be a lot happier. So if I look at the screen, I want to make sure that that histogram touches the right side. That's going to be the proper exposure. This forward dial adjusts the exposure compensation, so I'll just drag that to the right. And you can see the picture is getting brighter and brighter. Thus, I can just use the ESP metering and actually get the job done. Now, I just realized I made a common mistake. I turned on the self timer and then I forgot to turn it off again. I wish it would reset automatically. It didn't. So now it's going to take 10 pictures. I'm going to turn the camera off to interrupt that. One of my photography tips is anytime you change the exposure compensation, anytime you set a metering mode, go back and fix it when you're done, because otherwise you'll forget that you did that. And the next time you pick up the camera, you're going to miss a shot because you forgot to change it back the way it should be. So let's go back and we'll set this to my favorite mode, sequential high. Now I'll talk about changing the ISO. The ISO, it's pronounced ISO and not ISO. If you're unsure about that, it's because the organization uses the name ISO based on a Greek word. It's not actually International Standards Organization. They're the International Organization of Standardization in English. Anyway, you can look it up, but trust me, it's not ISO, it's ISO. In practice, ISO is a measurement of the camera's sort of conceptual sensitivity. It's not a physical sensitivity, but more a software-based sensitivity. The higher your ISO, the brighter your picture will be, and the lower your ISO, the darker your picture will be. In direct sunlight, you will use a low ISO, like ISO 200. If you're taking pictures at a restaurant where it's really dark, you'll use a high ISO, like ISO 3200. High ISOs tend to give you noisier pictures that look worse, and low ISOs give you cleaner pictures that look just great. This is all covered in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography, so you don't need to memorize it all now. I just want to show you how to change the ISO. It's pretty easy. Just like everything else in this camera, hit that OK button, And then you can just scroll up or down until you find the ISO setting. There it is. Now, right now it's set to auto, which means the camera is going to take care of it. You will use auto almost all the time. If you master ISO and you know a scenario where you need to adjust it, you can do that. Low is equivalent to ISO 100 here, and it's not a native ISO on this camera. It's what they call an extended ISO. So using low is exactly like taking a picture with ISO 200, but overexposing at a stop. So if you're a technical person, it means it reduces the dynamic range. If you're not a technical person, don't use low. ISO 200 will give you the cleanest pictures, and it's what you would use in broad daylight anytime you have plenty of light. As you go higher and higher, you'll be working in dimmer and dimmer environments. 1600 can be good for like a sports game at dusk. You might get up to 3200 if you're shooting under like stadium lights at night. It's also good for indoor shots at night. And higher ISOs like ISO 6400 or ISO 12800 will give you very noisy pictures, but they might be what you need for hand-holding pictures in close to near darkness. So I'm going to go ahead and set this back to auto ISO just before I forget. If you want to take full manual control of your camera, again, just remember to switch it to manual mode here, and then also set the ISO manually. And then you will truly be taking complete control over everything. Oh, actually, my mistake. In manual mode, it does not support auto ISO. So in manual mode, you will always have to set the ISO yourself. I covered exposure compensation briefly before, but I'll cover it here again. Exposure compensation allows you to control the brightness of a picture. So often you'll take a picture and it'll simply be too dark. Maybe the sun or a bright sky, an overcast sky is behind the person you're taking a picture of. The sky, you'll be able to see detail in it, but the person's face will just be completely in shadow. If that's the case, you'll use the exposure compensation dial in either the aperture, program, or shutter priority modes. And you'll use this dial to increase the exposure. Pull it to the right to make everything brighter. Pull it to the left to make everything darker. The brilliance of these mirrorless cameras is that you can preview the exposure by looking at the back or looking through the viewfinder. So just use that histogram, make sure the entire histogram is filled up over to the right side, or that the picture just looks good to your eye. Adjust the exposure compensation. And when you're done with the picture, set it back to 0 so that it's back to the base before you take your next picture. Now let's talk about bracketing. Bracketing takes a series of pictures at different exposures, allowing you to pick the picture that was properly exposed later. Now, it's not that important on a digital camera like this because you can just see the picture right away and change the exposure and retake it if you need to. You don't even have to take a picture. You can just see it in the viewfinder. In the film days, you'd have to wait at least a few hours to get your film home and develop it and then process it, and then you'd be like, oh, I missed the exposure. So bracketing made perfect sense because if you miss the exposure, well, you'd have one that was properly exposed, right? Everybody used to bracket. Nowadays, bracketing is still good for one thing, and that's taking high dynamic range pictures, HDR pictures. HDR pictures do two things. One, you can make those artistic HDR photos. Look up Trey Ratcliffe if you're not sure what I'm talking about. They can be just beautiful. And HDR is also useful in a very practical way for eliminating shadow noise and allowing you to capture the bright highlights in the sky and the deep shadows that might be cast by the sun for something in the foreground. So bracketing in HDR can be used to vastly improve the technical perfection of your pictures. And that is particularly important on little cameras like this. If you have Adobe Lightroom, you can check out the built-in HDR feature, which will blend three or more pictures together and make you just a technically perfect picture with almost no effort. You won't often use bracketing, but if you're a landscape photographer, bracketing can be really key to make sure that you get nice, clean images with tons of dynamic range. There's an entire chapter in Stunning Digital Photography about HDR, and my Lightroom book covers it too. To turn on bracketing, hit the menu button here, and then go to the Camera 2 icon. Then the second menu item down is bracketing. Scroll to the right, select On, and then scroll to the right again, and you'll see a set of options. Now this top option is telling you how many frames it's going to take and at what exposure difference. So 3f 1.0 EV means 3 frames, 3 pictures, with a 1 stop exposure difference. That's not usually what I would recommend. So I'll scroll to the right, and instead I'll select 5 frames at 1-stop exposure. You might even go all the way to 7 frames at the 0.7 exposure, but 5 frames at 1-stop exposure is going to be enough to handle just about any HDR scenario. Now you'll see a bunch of other options down here, white balance bracketing, all of this. Those I don't ever see any reason to use, especially in the way that I recommend shooting, but the AE bracketing at the top here is terribly useful. Here's something to be really careful about when you're setting bracketing. After you change the options, be sure to hit the OK button here. I'll hit that button to actually set it. If you don't, bracketing won't actually be turned on. If you just hit the menu to get out, or if you start shooting again, it won't save your setting. So now that bracketing is turned on, what you want to do is set it to continuous and then hold the shutter down until it takes all your photos, all 5 photos. So it just now took 5 bracketed pictures, and if I hit the play button and go back through them, the first picture is the properly exposed picture according to the camera's metering system. The second picture is 2 stops underexposed. The third picture is 1 stop underexposed. The fourth picture is 1 stop overexposed. And then the last picture is 2 stops overexposed. The later pictures have a higher shutter speed, and thus there's more chance that they'll be a little bit shaky. Anyway, that's how bracketing works. The rest needs to happen on your computer. This camera does have built-in HDR features, but I do not recommend using them. Instead, I recommend bracketing and handling the HDR processing on your computer. If you use it built-in HDR processing, it doesn't look great and you can't fix it later, so you'll just be kicking yourself. Trust me, just do bracketing. This camera has a built-in flash, or you can attach an external flash to the top hot shoe here, and you'll get much better light out of that external flash. But the built-in flash is good in a pinch for adding a little bit of fill flash. There's a button to the left of the flash here. Just push it and the flash pops right up. And at that point, the flash is configured to take a picture. Well, it's not going to do it when I have bracketing turned on, so I need to go in and turn bracketing off. I just told you guys that it's important to revert settings when you're done taking pictures, and I forget. So I just turned bracketing back off. With the flash up, the camera won't necessarily always take a picture. It will look at the scene and decide if the scene needs more light. You can control the flash and force it to be on, or control the output of it, and they make it all pretty easy. Once again, I'll click the OK button here, and then scroll up and down until you get to the flash settings. By default, it's set to auto, which means the camera will just make up its mind. If you set it to red eye, it's going to do this kind of pulsing thing that will allow the pupils of the person you're taking a picture of to constrict a little bit and can reduce that red eye effect. It's good for portraits. If you're using that for a portrait, well, first you're going to get terrible pictures because any on-camera flash like that doesn't make good light. But you should at least use red eye, so at least they don't get red eye. You can use this to turn the flash on and just kind of force it on. You can see now it's going to flash no matter what, even if it doesn't think it needs the extra light. That's useful for fill flash. If you're taking a picture in direct sun, I'll almost always turn fill flash on just to kind of offset those deep shadows a little bit. That's covered in chapter 3 of Stunning Digital Photography. You can also force the flash off, though it's always a little bit easier just to close that lid. But I suppose if you wanted to do it from the menu system, that's where you would do it. A couple more options. The red eye slow is just another red eye option that fires the flash a little bit slower. You have a couple of different slow sync options here, which will fire the flash later than normal. It's a specialized technique that you won't often use. The last option here gives you complete control over the flash output. So you'll select that and then hit the info button here. And now you can scroll up or down to control the exact output. So at full output, the flash is going to fire as bright as it possibly can. And as you scroll down, it will fire with less and less light. Half means 1 stop less light, half the light, 1/4 the light, 2 stops less, all the way down to 1/64 of the light. So if I fire this now, it's not nearly as bright as if I crank it all the way up to full. Oh, close your eyes, Justin. As we review those two pictures, you can see at 1/64, the picture is much dimmer. At full flash, it's much, much brighter. As always, you should make sure that you go in and reset that to auto once you're done fooling with the light. Anytime you use that flash, take a look at the picture. If there's too much light in it, you might need to go in and manually adjust it. Besides manually adjusting the flash output, which can be difficult for different changing situations, you can adjust flash exposure compensation, which allows the camera to make an intelligent decision about the flash, but then tells it to back off a stop or two. So you could say, hey, camera, you decide how much light there should be, but then do half that, because often what the camera decides is simply too much. So click that OK button, and right below the flash settings, you'll see the flash exposure compensation. It's the lightning bolt with a plus or minus. Now with that in, just use your exposure compensation dial here at the front to dial in less flash. So -1 here outputs half the light, -2 outputs 1/4 the light. So in sunlight scenarios where I'm using the technique called fill flash, which we discussed in chapter 3, I'll usually start at -1.3 stops of fill flash, take a look at the picture, and if it's too much light, crank it down. If it's not enough light, crank it up a little bit. Once again, as always, once you adjust that, you want to go in and just set it back to 0 when you're done. Now I'll talk about white balance. And like metering, white balance is a setting that you don't necessarily have to worry about, especially if you set your camera to take raw pictures rather than JPEG pictures. That's something I'll discuss in a little bit. White balance changes what your camera defines as white. This is a really confusing concept because we take for granted that white things are white, but white light is not always white. The sun gives off a white light, and a white piece of paper in the sun looks white, but a white piece of paper to our eyes also looks white when it's under an incandescent light or a street light. And even though those lights are not giving off pure white light, they're giving off white light that's a little bit orange or a little bit green. That basically means that they're just sending out more green frequency photons than they are red or blue photons. So it's like a balance of the different light frequencies that it's giving off, and it can shift a little bit. And our brain fixes that for us automatically, thank goodness, or we'd be looking at streetlights and headlights all as being all these crazy different colors. Your camera will do that for you too, and that's called auto white balance. And you should just leave your camera in auto white balance basically all the time. But if you do want to manually set the white balance, as we discussed in chapter 3 of Stunning Digital Photography, I'll show you how. So click that OK button. And now we'll scroll down until we get to the white balance setting. And you can see here, WB, that's white balance. It's set to auto by default. You have options that make sense. Sunny is for full sun, shadow, cloudy days, incandescent lights, fluorescent. And as you can see, as I'm pointing at this white table, the color is changing. Now, if you're under the right type of light, this will actually look white to you. So if you want to make sure that you nail the color, if you're getting strange orange looking pictures, the solution to your problem is to change the white balance. When you're done, go back and select auto again. I want to briefly discuss how to capture video with this camera. It's a decent video camera that's capable of capturing full HD video. There's a dedicated button for recording video here. So basically you just compose your picture like you normally do and then hit the record button and it will start recording. You can focus while recording just by touching the screen, and it does a pretty good job. Note that the camera has a stabilizer on the sensor, so it will even out some of your handshake and make the video look just great. I love this camera as a video camera. To stop recording, hit that again. There are a few video related options, but the default settings are probably going to be fine for you, most of you. I'll hit the menu button and then go down to the gears here. And on the second page under I, you see record, erase. You'll see movie here. So I'll scroll to the right and select that. Here you can see a bunch of settings related to capturing video. The top one here is the most important. That's the mode. It's in P mode right now, which is program mode. It means the camera is going to decide your shutter speed and aperture, and that's fine for most people. If you want to take manual control of the aperture or shutter speed, you can select aperture or shutter mode. You can also select M mode for manual mode. That's going to kick in if you actually bother to move the camera over to the movie mode here. You don't have to do that when recording video. You can record video in one of the other modes. But if you do switch to that mode, you'll get some extra features down here. It changes the display a little bit, gives you some other options like about the white balance, and it just makes video recording a little bit easier. That's where you would configure whether or not you're controlling the aperture. Just to show you a couple of the other options that I consider important about recording videos. The movie mic option here set it on to record sound. I don't know why you would ever want to record a movie without sound. We have an option here for wind noise effect, which if you're in a windy environment and you're using the on-camera microphone, you would probably want to turn that on. And that's about it. This camera does not have a microphone port, so you're pretty much stuck using the external or the internal mic. If you want better sound, you can get an external recorder like a Zoom H1, which is just a little pocket recorder, or you could even record sound with your iPhone and something like the Rode Smart Plus lav mic, hook it up to somebody's lav. You can record sound with a separate recorder, and then in post-processing, sync up the audio. I'm not going to get deep into video editing here, but I just wanted to present as an option for getting better sound out of this great video camera using an external recorder and syncing it later. Now I'm going to show you how to format a memory card. Most memory cards nowadays will allow you to take thousands of pictures, but at some point you're going to fill it up. You should unload those pictures onto your computer, make sure they're backed up, and then you can format your memory card, which is just clearing it off, letting you have more space. Hit the menu button, and then on the first camera icon here, go to Card Setup, scroll to the right, and you'll see two options, All Erase and Format. They do basically the same thing, which is to erase the memory card. Formatting is generally the better option. It can, well, they're the same difference, but I usually just select Format, but you probably won't ever see a big difference. If you accidentally format a memory card, you can probably recover the pictures and files from it using a tool called Photo Rec, like Photo Recover. Chapter 5 of Stunning Digital Photography shows you how to do that, or you can just Google it. It's a completely free tool. Do not pay for a photo recovery tool. Photo Rec works just great. Now I want to show you how to disable the beep on the camera. That beep, oh, you can hear it every time it locks in focus. Oh, man. When you're in a wedding, I'm a wedding photographer, and there's always people in the stands who are trying to take pictures of the bride, and you just hear this throughout the church. Just little beeps. The beep, it tells you when things are in focus, but it's annoying. You can just look at the screen and see this in focus. So I always tell people, turn that beep off. Go down to the gear icon, and then under the D option here, you'll see, where is it? It's on the second page. It's on the third page. There it is. This little speaker icon. Select that and turn it off. And now, as I focus, oh, beautiful silence. Just a beautiful green box telling me that I'm in focus and no annoying beeping. Please turn that off. Now I'll show you how to take raw pictures. Raw pictures provide better quality than JPEG, but you can't directly share raw files. Instead, you can read them into an application like the free Google Picasa or the paid Adobe Lightroom. Those applications will process the pictures and probably give you better results than the JPEG that your camera would take, and then allow you to easily share it from there. So there's this extra step involved of using a computer before you share it, but it's probably going through your computer anyway. Raw files also allow you to fix mistakes that you've made. So if you accidentally under or overexpose a picture, you can actually fix that on your computer. Raw files capture all the data from your camera's sensor and don't process it. JPEG files take that camera's data and then compress it down and clip off things like highlights and shadows that it simply thinks aren't necessary. But often we screw things up, or we want to process the picture a little bit differently. Anyway, shoot raw. Even if you don't edit your pictures now, you might in the future, or maybe your grandkids will want to edit some pictures that you took, and having that extra data will allow them to get much better results out of it. To configure RAW, click the OK button, bring up this menu, and then scroll down until you see this option, which shows you different configurations for capturing pictures. You can see by default it's set to LN, which means large pictures at normal quality. Scroll one to the left and you have large pictures at fine quality. I would always use large pictures at fine quality even if I were shooting JPEG. Your other option is RAW. That's what I'm suggesting you use. It works exactly the same, except you just have to load them into Picasa or Lightroom, but I recommend doing that anyway. So now that I've captured RAW files, I take pictures just like I always do. They take up a little more space, well, a lot more space, but the quality can really be better. So go ahead and configure RAW. And if you're not sure, there's tons of information in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography, or you can even find videos on YouTube about it. Now let's talk about customizing some of these buttons. If you were annoyed at the direction that these dials turned, or which dial does what, or if you want to make use out of these little FN buttons here, this camera allows you to customize all of that. hit the menu button, and once again go down to the gear icon here, and then the B option here gives you all the options around configuring the buttons and dials. So this first option here, button function, select that and you'll see there are different options for configuring just about every button on the camera. FN1 is this button here, and by default it turns on the auto exposure system and the autofocus system. Those are also linked to the shutter button. So if you're using that, you can feel free to allow it to configure it to do something else, which could be changing your magnifying the screen, for example. I'll select magnify, and then as we're looking through the viewfinder, if I hit that, boom, it zooms in and allows me to focus more precisely. That's particularly useful if you're doing manual focusing work. I really like being able to customize the button like that. Other options that you might consider, we'll go back into the menu system here. There's also function 2, which is this button that's right on the top. And by default, it actually does something pretty useful. It brings up this multi-function tool, which allows you to see the histogram and actually adjust the exposure of the picture. That's cool, but it's only for JPEG files. It wouldn't impact your RAW files. And for me, I'd rather make those settings in post by adjusting the RAW file rather than trying to adjust it on the fly. I'd rather focus on other aspects of the picture taking process. So maybe I won't want to use that as my function 2 button, and I can go in and change it to something useful like focus peaking, another tool for manual focusing. Focus peaking, if I turn that on, you can see now it's highlighting the parts of the frame that have, not necessarily perfectly in focus, but that have lots of contrast. So as I zoom in here, you can see as I move the camera around, if I pull it back, there you go. You can see that line going across the monitor showing exactly which part of the monitor is in focus. Focus peaking just highlights the in focus parts of the scene. I find that to be a terribly useful function when you're doing manual focus. You're doing autofocus, you might not find it that useful. You can also reassign the recording button if you don't record video and change the behavior of the directional pads. Under dial function here, you can control how the dials behave in different modes. So your first option here is to select which camera mode you want to configure, program mode, aperture priority. And now you can change what each of the dials do. So I can control what the back button does and what the front button does by iterating through the up and down options here. So here you can see I can configure aperture priority mode to allow me to control the flash exposure compensation with the back dial if that's what I wanted to do. The options are almost limitless. If you find the directions of the dial confusing, if you're used to a different camera where they go in different directions, you can just go in and configure which of the dials do what. Anyway, configure it so that you feel comfortable with the camera. This camera has the option to take pictures at an interval and automatically stitch them together into a time lapse. I'll just show you where that is. It's a lot of fun to take a time lapse. You can go under the camera 2 option here and then go down to time lapse settings. Scroll to the right, select on, and then scroll to the right again. And you can configure how many frames it should take, how long it waits until it takes its first picture, how long it waits between pictures, and whether you want it to just capture still photos or actually stitch them together into a movie. Now, I actually prefer to have it capture just still pictures so that I can stitch them together on my computer. It just gives me more control. But if you want to skip that step and have it do it automatically, just set time-lapse movie 2 on. Time-lapses are a lot of fun, and it's also a great way to take pictures of star trails, which I discuss in chapter 10. There I recommend if you don't have time-lapse on your camera that you'll need an external trigger, but you do. You have time-lapse capabilities here, so you don't have to worry about that. It's all built right into the camera. Multiple exposures is a project that we show you how to do in chapter 1 of Stunning Digital Photography. And I want to show you how to turn that on in your camera. Go back into the menu here, and under camera 2, there's the option for multiple exposure here. So you can choose how many frames you want under the frame option here. 2 frames is pretty standard for multiple exposures. Then you can adjust how they're overlaid. Usually you want the pictures to be overlaid automatically. So with those settings, I can now go in and automate and take a multiple exposure picture. So with multiple exposure, what you'll do is take one picture, for example, of this cup, and then take a second picture that will overlay it, and it creates kind of a ghostly effect. Anyway, Chelsea does a much better job of describing exactly how to create beautiful multiple exposure pictures in the project in Chapter 1. I just wanted to show you where you could turn it on in your camera. Now I'll show you how to clean the sensor. It's actually really easy. We covered this in Chapter 5 because you'll get dust on your sensor and then spots will appear in every single picture. Some cameras you have to like move the mirror out of the way. This camera doesn't have a mirror. So just push that button in, twist the lens to the left until it pops off, and that exposes the sensor. Be careful here. Turn your camera off, take the battery out, and then you can use, I usually use a lens clear brush, but I provide specific recommendations in Chapter 5. Just get a little brush, clean it very carefully. You don't have to send it out for service. It is something you can do yourself. Now let's go over some lens and tripod suggestions. I'm just going to recommend my favorite lenses and a tripod that I recommend everybody start with. First, you can buy either Olympus or Panasonic lenses to use with this camera. Even though it's an Olympus camera, Panasonic lenses work great and we use them all the time. The Olympus lenses can often be a slightly better value because the Panasonic lenses have image stabilization built in. They'll work fine, but this camera has image stabilization on the lens, and therefore you don't need that extra feature to be built into the lens itself. The first lens I recommend everybody get is well, there are a couple of different lenses. You have a couple of different options, but get a fast, what they call a standard prime or a normal prime. My favorite is this 20mm f1.7. It's nice and fast. I have it mounted on the E-M10 here. This is actually a Panasonic lens that doesn't have image stabilization built into it. You can pick them up on the used market. There's a Mark I and Mark II version. The Mark I version is slightly sharper, so that's the one I usually get. Just get it on eBay or something, or you can go right to this link here and check out the Olympus version of that lens. There's also a 17mm pancake lens, which is shown in this picture. Again, I'm recommending the 20mm f1.7, but the 17mm f2.8 is a little bit wider, but a little bit slower. It doesn't gather quite as much light. Those are really cheap, only $250, and you'll get so much better pictures, especially in low light. For me, I will just leave this 20mm attached while I'm on vacation and just rely almost entirely on that one prime lens. If you want to get great portraits at a reasonable price, the 45mm f1.8 lens is fantastic. You can find Panasonic and Olympus varieties of them. I'm showing the Olympus version here, and I can't physically show it to you now because I'm using it to film myself. This is this camera, the lens that I'm using right now, attached to a Panasonic GH2 that I'm using to record. It's a fantastic lens that provides great background blur, and it's incredibly sharp. It goes for about $400. Great just for all-around portraits, and it's small and lightweight and fits in your pocket. If you get more serious about portraits, this bad boy here, it's expensive, but it's the best lens in the entire Micro Four Thirds system, in my opinion. The Olympus 75mm f1.8 lens. It looks fantastic, it's heavy, and whoo, look at that big front element. It takes pictures with spectacular background blur, and it is just like record-breaking sharp. You will take unbelievably sharp photos with it with any of your cameras. It will just make fantastic portraits at a high price, but they're very sturdy, so consider getting a used copy. I bought mine used. I also want to recommend a nice upgrade to the kit lens that probably came with your camera. It's a great travel lens. It's what they call a super zoom because it zooms from wide angle to super telephoto. The Olympus 14 to 150mm lens. If you only want to carry one lens, this is the one I recommend you get. The results will not be as sharp as these prime lenses that I recommend, not nearly. And you'll end up with much noisier pictures in dim environments. So for that reason, for these cameras, I like the prime lenses. But if you just want one lens to carry all the time, get that one. A nice upgrade for low light, if you want a zoom lens, is the lens I'm using here, the Olympus 12 to 40mm f2.8. It's not nearly as sharp as these prime lenses, not nearly. But the sharpness is okay, and it's more versatile because you get to zoom. Costs $1,000. It's an expensive lens. I also want to recommend a tripod. This is a starter tripod, but it's a great all-in-one tripod. And even if you decide that you want a higher-end tripod later, you'll still find yourself using this Dolica tripod later because it's just a great travel tripod. It fits in your bag, it's lightweight. Anyway, it goes for 46 bucks. It's very versatile. It has this little hook on the bottom so you can hang a bag from it, and it adds weight to the tripod, therefore making it more stable. Just a great all-around lens. And I want to say your education isn't done here. You figured out the buttons and dials. Hopefully you worked along. If you didn't, grab your camera, back it up, back this video up, and take each step with me, learning all the buttons and dials. But after you figure out the controls, you'll need to start learning the art and science of photography so that things like f-stop and flash exposure compensation make sense to you, and you know just how much to use to get great results. Stunning Digital Photography teaches you all those techniques, and if you're not a book person, it's got 12 hours of video. You don't have to read the book, but it's best when you read the book and work through the videos. Each chapter has optional quizzes if you want to just test yourself and make sure that you retained everything. Those quizzes challenge you by requiring you to apply the skills that you've developed, and that's just a mechanism that I created to make the lessons stick in your long-term memory a little bit better. There's also a Facebook community that you can join with lots of people who are also learning photography. I'm there too. We're all supportive. We'll help you with your specific problems and give you feedback on your pictures. Once you start to collect a few pictures, you'll find organizing them can be a challenge. Finding pictures of a specific date of a specific friend can be difficult. Lightroom is a great way to organize your pictures and also edit them. So just about any editing task that most people want to do can be done in Lightroom. It's a fairly inexpensive application, and I have a book with 14 hours of video that will cost you under 10 bucks. You can work through the videos just like a video training course. You can read the book just like a book, or for best results, use them both together. Also comes with 250 Lightroom presets if you're into Lightroom. That's an exciting thing. And to help you sort out the difference between this lens and which flashes you should get, which tripod you should get, check out my photography buying guide. It has over 16 hours of video, and it's a big fat book with tons of detail that help you sort out all the camera gear nonsense and could save you thousands and thousands of dollars. I hope this has been helpful. Please share it with your friends. Send them over to sdp.io/tutorials to find a tutorial for their camera. And for more free videos with no fee required, nothing at all, just click subscribe and you'll see we release 3 new videos every week. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday. Free educational content forever or until we get bored. Thanks. We'll see you later.